Hi, everyone. Hope those of you who are joining us are doing well today. Let's just start off with a couple. Well, first of all, this is the last lecture topic we're doing for this semester. It was always planned to be the last one. So congratulations. We all made it. It has not been easy, but you guys have done a really great job joining the lectures and doing well in the quizzes and the midterm. And it's been stressful for everyone. If we can make it through this semester, we can make it through anything. So uh, just a pat on the back for everyone for making it this far. So today's the last lecture that will be included on your final exam. I know I've said this a couple times already, but I don't know people who need to hear it again. So just a reminder, next Tuesday will be the extra credit Superfund site presentations. It'll be during regular lecture time. You only need to join us if you are giving an extra credit presentation. If you have any questions about that presentation, just feel free to email me. I'll send out more instructions later this evening or tomorrow. But if you are doing a presentation, I'm going to need you to email me the presentation no later than Monday evening. And on Tuesday during class time, I will upload all the different presentations. I should be able to give each individual student presenter access in Blackboard Collaborate. So when it's your time to present, you should be able to use your audio and scroll through your slides. So that's the plan for next Tuesday. That will add up to 10 extra credit points to your Superfund site assignment. And remember, you can go over 100% of that assignment. So even if you got a 50 out of 50, doing the presentation can still help you in other areas of the class. And then next Thursday, we have our final exam review. And then the following Tuesday is your final exam. The final exam, I will have an open window when you guys will be able to take it, probably similar to the second quiz around 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., but I will finalize that and I'll send out a reminder email. Okay, everything sound good? We're almost there. This is the home stretch. So let's get started on our last lecture today. There are no lecture notes on Blackboard today. I haven't made lecture notes for this. This is not a lecture that's included in your textbook. So I will help you guys with important things to note, but I would just take your own notes for this presentation. Okay, so the first thing I really want to point out is that I am not a criminologist. I am not an expert on wildlife crime. So I do want to remind you guys, I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the semester, but you can't major in environmental science, obviously, at John Jay, but you can minor in what's called environmental justice. Sci 112 is one of the courses that goes towards this minor, so you guys have already completed a part of the requirements. And there is one really interesting class in this minor and offered at John Jay called environmental crime. It's been offered online in the past, so some of these classes that have been offered online for many semesters, are maybe a good idea to take going forward if we need to move everything online, because these courses have been online and have ironed out the kinks a long time ago. So environmental crime, if you're interested, if this lecture kind of sparks your interest, this is a great course to take. And again, this ties into that environmental justice minor at John Jay. I will post the review PowerPoint on Blackboard for the final exam. But as always, if you can join us during the actual review, it'll probably be helpful for you. The review PowerPoint will be a little bare bones, and I will go through more detail in the actual lecture, but I will post the PowerPoint online for the review. Someone asked that question. Okay, so just in a couple important definitions we should start off before we discuss wildlife crime and different sectors of wildlife crime. What do we mean when we say wildlife? We are talking about any non-human animals and plants that aren't companion or domesticated animals. So wildlife in this sense, we're not talking about cats and dogs. We're not talking about cows and horses and sheep. Non-human animals and plants, so including plants and trees. That's often overlooked in wildlife, but when we mean wildlife, we mean animals, flora and fauna. Wildlife trafficking is the illegal cross-border trade in animals and plants. The cross-border part of that is important. So when we're discussing wildlife trafficking, we mean trading animals illegally from country to country. We're not talking about illegal trade that occurs domestically. And then poaching. So poaching is the illegal hunting, killing, or capturing of the non-human animal using things like guns, snares, traps, and pits or nets. So depending on if the animal is traded, like a body part of the animal is traded, then obviously the animals are killed prior to the trafficking event. Some of these animals are trafficked live, so then they need to be captured either through traps or snares or nets. So wildlife trafficking is an extremely lucrative category of global crime. It's the fourth most lucrative global crime after drugs, humans, and arms. The value is anywhere between 7 billion and 23 billion per year. So obviously it's a criminal activity. We don't know exactly how much these people are making. It's important to note that profits of wildlife crime are often very high, and there's much less risk than, say, drug trafficking. Traffickers, if they're caught, they often simply pay a fee rather than go to jail in many instances. So there's less risk in this type of, less risk, more reward typically in this type of crime, which makes it really kind of appealing to a wide group of people. Illegal wildlife trafficking compromises a country's security, and it involves many, many other forms of illegal trafficking. They're often run by criminal groups. You often see a lot of issues of countries that have problems with illegal trafficking. They're more corrupt nations. The profits that are used, the profits that are gained by these organizations through illegal wildlife trade, they're usually used to finance other forms of crime like terrorism or civil conflict. And wildlife crime is very closely linked to other forms of trafficking. For example, you often see illegal guns being trafficked. You need a very powerful, intense gun to take down a rhino, for example, and also money laundering. So there's a lot of money being moved around and needs to be laundered before it can be spent in more clean fashions. So almost every single country on the planet is involved somehow in this illegal wildlife trade. You need to consider the source country, the country that the plants and animals come from. That plants and animals are then go through many different countries, typically in transit, until they finally reach the consumer. And in each country, there are many different people that are involved in this criminal, organization, the flow of these wildlife and the illegal wildlife and plants. So it usually starts with an individual who's the poacher or a hunter or a criminal group. You then go through several middlemen or the market, a domestic market, before it goes through a transit country. You need people involved in the wildlife trafficking trade to manage through all these different countries that it has to travel through. Then it goes through more people when it reaches the consumer before it's ultimately used as either medicine, food, pets, or as some sort of consumer good. There are so many different countries are involved, many different people are involved in the flow of these illegal trafficking. So many different sectors of the economy are impacted by this. So we're going to talk just about just a couple of these examples going forward, not all of them. But remember, we think mainly of animals, I think, when we think of wildlife trafficking, but it's also plants. So furniture, the picture at the top is rosewood, an exotic tree that is very rare, and it's used for expensive and illegal furniture. Art, decor, and jewelry is another category. The example for that category is elephant ivory. I'm going to go over that example. Fashion, another industry you see illegal wildlife use, especially in reptile skins and big cat skins. Cosmetics and perfume, agarwood, that's that picture of the tree you see on the bottom of the slide. Agarwood it's a sweet smelling tree, and it's used in perfume, but it is an endangered tree, and so all that is illegal. Food, medicine, and tonics, pangolin, rhino horns, bear bile. Pets, zoos, and breeding, you see things like parrots, turtles, and tortoises, and great apes. And then seafood, caviar and marine turtles. So these are the different trade sectors where you often see wildlife moving through, and we'll go through a couple of these examples specifically in these next couple of slides. Okay, so this is a global issue. Like I said, almost every country on the planet is involved some way in this wildlife crime. No single country is identified as the source of more than 15% of seized shipments. So there's not one country. You'll see a couple trends when I'll go through some of my examples, but there's not one country that dominates this industry. Like I said, it's a global issue. And even more so, there's no single species responsible for more than 6% of seizures. So it's a pretty diverse group that is being seized from these cross borders. It's not only elephant horns or only rhinoceros horns, for example. It's very diverse. There's nearly 7,000 different species seized in this database that was collected between 1999 and 2015 over all different groups of animals: mammals, birds, reptiles, corals, and fish. So even though many different countries are involved, many different species are involved, there are some groups of organisms that are more closely tied to specific regions than others. So for example, Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, typically you see corals from those regions. Central and South America is especially known for birds. So many birds are sourced and illegally trafficked from that area. Northern America is especially known for reptiles, and Africa is especially known for mammals. So, like I said, many different species are involved, but if we break this down by share of taxonomic class, mammals make up 30% of all the seizures. So just a reminder, anytime you see these type of graphs, it's good to be able to interpret them. So mammals are the #1 class that is seized. That would be a good question. And if I showed you a graph like this, you should be able to interpret it. So for example, in Asia, mammals make up the biggest seizure class. You can tell that by just the green bar is the widest under Asia. So that'd be how you could interpret this graph on a final exam, for example. Okay, so an important term that you guys should know is, in terms of wildlife crime, is CITES. So CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It is a trade agreement. It is not an international criminal law. So if you are so this CITES, there are 183 governments that have signed on to this trade agreement. If you are to break part of the trade agreement, you're not criminally held liable. Like I said, it's not criminal law, it's a trade agreement, but you could be removed from CITES, from being able to trade with these other countries, which has really major economic impacts. So this is one of our biggest tools in terms of managing the trade of wildlife and making sure that we are not allowing endangered species to be traded at levels that are unsustainable. So what CITES does is it lists species that are traded as either Appendix 1 species or Appendix 2 species. So if you are on in this CITES agreement and you are listed as an Appendix 1 species, those are the species that are threatened with extinction, and they're really not allowed to be traded between countries. They're only allowed to be traded in really exceptional circumstances, and typically those circumstances are involved with scientific research, not for consumers or to make any sort of profit. So Appendix 1 species are very rare, threatened with extinction, really can't be traded under any circumstances, or very limited circumstances. Most species are listed as Appendix 2 species. These species can be traded legally, so countries are allowed to trade these species between each other, but they require permits from the export country to be able to trade them, and each country is going to have a quota. So they have a certain number that they're only allowed to trade. Anything over that number then would be considered illegal trade. Appendix 3 are a rarer class. These are species that are protected in at least one country,
but not globally. And so that country has asked specifically for these species to be listed under CITES to help control the trade, because they may be important or culturally or rare in one country, but more common in other nations. And so they're kind of an exceptional class. But that would be a good thing to take notes on. Appendix 1 are threatened with extinction, really no trade. Appendix 2 can be traded legally. That is what CITES, that's a big component of this agreement. So like I said, most species that are listed under CITES, this agreement, are going to be Appendix 2 species. So we're fauna are animals, flora are plants, obviously. So of all the species that are listed, 669 of the animals are on Appendix 1, and nearly 5,000 are Appendix 2, and only 190 are that special category Appendix 3. If we look at plants, 334 are Appendix 1, 29,000 are Appendix 2, so there are many, many more plants that are listed under CITES than animals, and only 12 are Appendix 3. So Appendix 2 is definitely the biggest category. Most species are able to be traded, but with certain limits on their trade. Just to show you pick one specific class of mammals, so Canidae, which includes dogs, foxes, and wolves, and just some examples of each category. So Appendix 1 is a bush dog, which is found in Central and Southern America. This species is endangered, close to extinction, cannot be traded unless exceptional circumstances, like I said, used in research, which is very rare. Appendix 2 is the Blandford's fox, is an example of a species in this class that's protected under CITES. This species can be traded, but you need licenses to trade it, and there are quotas. Appendix 3 is the golden jackal. This species is found in Southeast Europe and Asia, and India specifically has asked this species for protection under CITES. So this is one of those rare examples of a species that has some sort of cultural or scientific significance to one country, conservation reasons in one country and not globally. All right, so let's talk about a couple of these economic sectors and where and example species in the illegal wildlife trade in each. So when we talk about art, decor, and jewelry, there are a lot of examples I could have gone over, but I chose the African elephant and ivory to discuss. So in the 1930s, there were about 10 million wild African elephants, a huge number. Today, there's estimated to be about 500,000 elephants, so there's been a drastic decline in elephant numbers. Elephants are found in 37 African countries, but a majority, so over 60%, are found in 3 countries. So Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania have most of the world's elephants. There are 2 different subspecies of elephant. Now, I think I read actually very recently these were actually declared different species, but savanna elephants and forest elephants. Forest elephants are on the top, savanna elephants are on the bottom in the photo on the right. Obviously, they're named for where they can be found, the habitat they live in, either the forest or the savanna. Forest elephants are much smaller than savanna elephants. Forest elephants also have bigger ears and are a slightly different color, and their tusks hang down low and straight rather than bent out, which you see in a savanna elephant. So their tusks are why these animals are traded. They're made of ivory. Their tusks of the elephant are actually their upper incisors, so they're one pair of their teeth. Really importantly, and why this is so devastating for elephants, is elephant tusks extend very far into their cranial cavity. So the tusks that you actually see when you look at an elephant, there is much more of that tusk that goes up into the elephant's head, essentially. And so when these elephants are poached, when the poachers take the tusks, they need to kill the elephant, because then they slice open the elephant's head so they can get a bigger chunk of the tusk, essentially. So it's not like you could sedate the elephant and, chop off their tusks and then the elephant would survive, and you take the elephant's tusks, but you're not causing the extinction of the species. The elephants are killed so that they could slaughter the elephants and take a bigger portion of their tusks. And their tusks grow up to 7 inches per year, so they can get very, very long. you rarely see these big bull elephants in the wild that have very, very long tusks because they have been hunted out of the population and their genes are not being passed on to future generations that would also have those large tusks. So as a result, the tusks that are being seized are much thinner and shorter now than they were several decades ago because those elephants just don't exist anymore. And hunters are also going after females and young males that have shorter tusks. But this obviously leads to disasters for the population. You start killing the young individuals in the population and you start seeing really quick population declines. Elephants are extremely social species and they're extremely intelligent. So they tend to live in herds of about 10 individuals, but up to 70 individuals led by one female matriarch. They mourn their dead. Like I said, they're very social. So you start taking out individuals of a herd and it can be really devastating for the other individuals that remain. So in the 1800s, there are estimated to be around 26 million elephants, so it was definitely an abundant species. Well, we started to see the decline of the elephants happen in the early 1900s when safari for European males started becoming very popular. So it was considered an indicator of how wealthy you were, your status in society, and just your overall manliness if you were able to afford a safari in Africa. And then, I mean, look at that picture of that man on top of all those, think of all those elephants that represents. One person would then go on safari and kill, dozens of elephants. There was an ivory frenzy in the United States around this time, so there was mass production of combs, brush handles, piano keys, pool balls. These were all made from ivory from elephants. And so about 1913, U.S. was consuming 200 tons of ivory a year, which represented a really large number of elephants. So this is when we started to see these really drastic population declines from millions of elephants down to what we have less than 1 million today. So you can see this shows in the 1900s there were 10 million elephants and there's just a steady, steady, steady decline until there's about 500,000 elephants around today. As Western demand decreased, so as you started seeing less people in the United States and Europe heading to Africa to go on safari and kill elephants, which would have indicated a bounce back in the population. But right as Western demand decreased, Asian demand increased, and now most of the demand of ivory, almost all of it, comes from Asia. So there was this really large event several decades ago where I don't know why I didn't include a picture, but there's really famous pictures that spread across the world where the Kenyan president publicly burned stockpiles of ivory. We'll talk about this when we talk about solutions, if this is good or bad. But it was more of a symbolic gesture to try to indicate to the rest of the world that Africa and Kenya, they put more value on these animals alive than they do dead. So it was really a symbolic gesture. Two major things that really did help the elephant populations bounce back was in October '89 and January of 1990 when the African elephant was put on Appendix 1 of CITES. So remember that means that previously elephants could be traded legally. You could bring that ivory back into Europe, for example, but now as of 1989, well, that's not necessarily the case now, but Appendix 1 brought a lot of protection to the elephants. And then trade on ivory was banned shortly after in 1990, which caused the elephant population to rebound. So it got close to 1 million individuals. There was huge publicity during this time that trade was harmful and illegal, which resulted in a lot less demand from the consumers and plummeting ivory prices. Okay, all was good. Elephants were doing well for about a decade. Unfortunately, and I don't really know, there was a lot of pressure from these countries on CITES to allow them to add elephants back to the Appendix 2. So in 1997, CITES agreed to allow elephants in Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, there's a typo there, to be downlisted to Appendix 2. This ivory primarily then was sold to Japan, and you started to see the elephant population shrink again. In 2000, South Africa also downlisted elephants, so they have less protection under this trade agreement. In 2008, China bought 108 tons of ivory legally through this agreement in a one-off sale. The idea was to try to limit demand, so to like flush the market with a lot of this ivory. But what it only really ended up doing was provide cover for smuggled ivory. So you had all of this ivory that was legally sold, and then illegally sold ivory was bundled with that ivory, and it provided cover for it to be traded. So I'm going to show you a couple of these maps. You'll see a lot of these maps when we talk about illegal trade of any sort, but we're talking about wildlife specifically here. So these light gray circles indicate a source of, so where the illegal trade in animals, where they're going, and the orange circles show the source, so where they came from. And the size of the circle indicates how much is moving to or from that country. So this graph is showing that China is the major source of elephant ivory. I'm sorry, this is confusing to say. China is the major destination of ivory, and the major sources of ivory obviously are where the elephants are found. So Kenya, looks like Mozambique, South Africa, these are large sources of the ivory. And then it flows through several different transit countries before most of it ends up in Asia, primarily China. That's where a lot of the demand is for the ivory now. So ivory now, it's detached from any sorts of practical use, right? We don't use ivory for pool balls and piano keys anymore. It's really more of a status symbol. So you'll see ivory being demanded by the consumers for like jewelry, decor in their houses, and art. So from 2009 to 2014, there were 91 shipments of ivory seized, which represents about 15,900 elephants. Like I said, a lot of these elephants now are young elephants in the population and females, so just taking out one female from this group can be really devastating to these populations. It's a positive feedback loop, meaning the more elephants that are poached, the scarcer elephants become, and then each individual elephant has a higher value in terms of, you know, the illegal market. So more poaching, more scarcity, increased value leads to more poaching, and therefore more scarcity. It just builds on each other, builds on each step. So there were some more recent positive developments. So in 2018, all trade in ivory and ivory products in China became illegal. This was a huge development and a huge win for elephant conservation organizations, and we are starting to see ivory prices declining. So we are hopeful that that'll start seeing more rebounding of the African elephant population. So there is a little bit of hope on the horizon for African elephants. Okay, so let's go now to a species many of you have probably never seen or maybe even heard of, but is a huge player in the international wildlife trade, which is the pangolin. This category we're going to talk about is food, tonics, and medicines. So those are pictures of pangolins on the right. There are 8 subspecies of pangolin, 4 in Africa and 4 in Asia. Even though they kind of look like reptiles because they've got scales, they are mammals. Their scales are made of keratin, which is the same thing human hair is made out of. They're nocturnal species. They eat termites and ants. They kind of look like anteaters, but they're not. They've got these big scales. To defend themselves, they roll into a ball as defense. They do not have teeth. They eat little bits of rock and sand in their stomach to grind up their food. And they give birth to one individual each time after a very long gestation, which is important for conservation because that means that the pangolin population grows really slowly, only one individual at a time, and they're pregnant for a very long time. So you start decimating the pangolin population, it's going to take a really long time for it to grow back. So this is an important point I may ask you guys about. Pangolins are the world's most trafficked animal. That's a real, like, I don't know, trivia quiz question that most people probably wouldn't know. So more so than elephants, than rhinos, than any type of tree or plant, or not tree or plant, we're only talking about animals, but pangolins are the world's most trafficked animal. And pangolins have a couple negative things going for it. So there are many different countries believe, kind of like incorrectly, many different things about pangolins. So their traffic is typically driven by belief in pangolins' magical powers and a demand for the meat. So specifically their scales. There are several communities and countries that believe that pangolin scales can be used to neutralize witchcraft and evil spirits. They believe that if you kill a pangolin and you burn its scales, the smoke can keep demons away and it can cure diseases. They have very high demand in certain Asian countries because it's still believed that pangolin scales can be used as a medicine to cure illness. Some tribes in Africa believe that if you see a pangolin, it's going to bring drought, and the only way to prevent that drought is to kill the animal. So there's a lot of mythical things about the pangolin that have been passed on from generation to generation, and a belief that if you consume the pangolin scales, it'll make you, strong and healthy. Obviously, they're incorrect, but they spell disaster for the pangolins as a species. So most sources of pangolins come from Indonesia and from some countries in Africa. And ultimately, the source of shipment, again, is in China, where they're typically used for medicine. This is just a close-up of the pangolin curled into a ball, so you can really see what these individual scales look like. The pangolins are killed, mercifully, usually before, or boiled to remove the scales, and then the scales are sold. This is a kind of graphic photo of the largest seizure of pangolins believed to ever be captured. It represents 4,000 dead pangolins. As you can see, these pangolins have all been boiled and their scales removed. So you can see the skin of the pangolin, and it's pretty upsetting. In this seizure, so they seized 4,000 dead pangolins. In the seizure, they found a couple. Yeah, I understand the scales were cool. Not this photo. This is an upsetting photo. They found 100 live pangolins. So another thing that these poachers would do is they'll keep a couple larger individuals and they'll force feed them to try to grow them and have bigger, more scales. So they also found some living individuals in the seizure as well, and those living individuals were released back to the wild. But the pangolin, at the brink of extinction because it's very popular to be traded. Okay. Fashion industry. Fashion, we're going to talk about reptile skins. The fashion industry obviously is very volatile. One day something is in fashion and then the next day it's not. And because the fashion industry is very volatile, farming these animals is risky economically. If you have a python farm and you want to sell these pythons for pythons, leather purses that are fashionable one season and then next season no one wants to buy a leather snakeskin purse, then your whole livelihood is destroyed. So wild sourcing, getting these animals from the wild rather than farming them, is less investment and often has less risk. About half of permits in 2016 for skins, feathers, and hair for the fashion industry, they came from wild sources. And there are 14 million wild source reptiles traded in the last decade, so a pretty large group. Next slide here. Okay, so there are over 10,000 different reptile species, but a really small portion, only 10% of those are listed under CITES. So there are many reptiles that are traded that there are no real monitoring or quotas involved. But just quickly, the groups of reptiles that are often traded under, there are CITES listed: crocodiles, there are a couple alligators and caimans, snakes, primarily pythons, also cobras and lizards, monitor lizards, and a Tegus lizard are those that are listed under CITES. But there are really only a couple species of reptiles that make up a vast majority of those that are seized or those that are traded illegally. So pythons, 50% of all seizures are pythons. But together, pythons, caimans, rat snakes, and monitor lizards, they make up about 90% of all the reptile skins that are seized. Pythons, the number one. And if we look at where these guys are going towards, so Singapore is a major destination of reptile skins. They have some of the best reptile tanneries, so where the skin goes to be made into, like, I don't know, a purse or a shoe in the world. So a lot goes to Singapore, and then a lot is exported from Singapore. Many reptiles come from South America and from a couple in parts of Europe and the United States. The orange arrows indicate farmed reptiles, and the green arrows are wild sources. So the United States is a source of these illegal trades from wild snakes, wild crocodiles. So on average, for every 1,000 skin that's legally traded, one is illegally traded, which seems really few, but it's most likely that there's a lot of unreporting in reptile skins. A lot of these reptiles are coming from South America, where there's not a lot of monitoring of this illegal trade. In terms of other animals, reptiles have relatively low value. You need a lot of living snakes in order to make 1 kilogram of skin. So many snakes going to make one purse or one pair of shoe. So it's not as economically lucrative for a lot of these criminal organizations to trade in reptiles. So the biggest challenge in terms of making sure this is done legally is monitoring harvesting quotas. So CITES, this agreement, they're going to give quotas to these individual countries. 90% go to specific organizations, 10% are going to go to communities. So some of these little communities, for example, this is really popular in Indonesia, where individuals from these communities are going out to harvest wild animals, wild pythons, for example, to then sell them to these middlemen that sell them to the tanneries. So licenses are required to do this, but most of these local people do not have these licenses, don't know that they're needed, and so that's why some of this trade becomes illegal. Even though I said they're relatively low value, if you're a person who lives in one of these little like tribal communities and you get $4 for every live python, like that could be a windfall for a lot of these communities. So even though they may say you're only allowed to get 1 python, per season, it's hard to tell people who need this money to eat, not to, I don't know, take 2, 3, or 4. So then the people that collect the pythons, they sell them to middlemen or the slaughterhouse. These are difficult to monitor because they're often decentralized, they're episodic, they pop up and then they disappear, they're difficult to control. They then go to a tannery where they actually process the reptile skin, and then exporters, and then different companies where they actually are made into the final product that you or I could buy. Just to point out, there are also a lot of challenges in terms of illegal wildlife trade with reptiles. Remember, we talked about flagship species and conservation and how certain uglier species, get less protection. It's often, you could also add, snakes and pythons to this list. Fewer people, people tend to not like snakes or pythons or reptiles. They think they're scary or gross or for whatever reason, so they sometimes get a little bit less protection than they should. Okay, so pets, zoos, and breeding. So the prior examples, they all required these animals to be killed, but in the zoo, pet, and breeding trade, which also can be done illegally, obviously this trade is in live animals. So it's large and complex. It involves birds, reptiles, and fish primarily, sometimes mammals. It's strongly influenced by culture. So for example, the pet trade in Italy is primarily dominated by birds because in Italy, culturally, for whatever reason, birds are very popular pets. They're not as popular, obviously, in the United States. So pet birds per 100,000 people in Italy is 21,000, which is kind of a crazy percentage. Many of these are bred commercially for pets, but they still need a wild stock. They still need to source them from the wild. It's often cheaper to get them from the wild than to breed them yourself. And we talked about genetic diversity, how it's important to get new genes into the gene pool. And one way to do that is to get animals from the wild rather than breeding them in small populations in these breeding centers. So the case study I want to talk about is parrots. The entire order of parrots, so all parrots are really CITES listed. So really any trade in parrots is going to have some sort of quota and monitoring towards it. In 1992, there was a Wild Bird Conservation Act in the United States, which really reduced parrots and wild birds that can be imported to the United States. Europe banned imports of wild birds in 2005 over concerns of the bird flu. So a lot of the trading you see of parrots is done illegally. The picture on the right is the African gray parrot, which is one that is commonly traded illegally. You may know this species because it is known for being super smart. This species of parrot has the intelligence of like a 4 to 6-year-old kid, and they know hundreds of words, many of the individuals of these parrots. They're critically endangered, so they should not be traded. They're protected under CITES 1. Their populations in some areas have declined, wild populations by like 90%, but only 35 individuals have been reported to be traded in CITES, so almost all trade of the African parrot is illegal. So main flows of parrots, main sources of parrots are Mexico and sub-Saharan Africa, and they're primarily going to Singapore, Middle Eastern countries, and Europe. So this parrot pets are a little bit different. Notice, before China had been a big destination, this is completely different. A lot of European countries and Middle Eastern countries are the big source of parrots. Destination of parrots, rather. There is huge mortality when you're killing these animals. Infants are captured from the nests. Oftentimes trees will just be cut down, and then any infants or eggs that survive, those are then sold. The trappers of these parrots, they often have little knowledge of CITES regulations, so they don't know they're breaking the law. And like I said, mortality is really high, also because you need to transport these individuals alive, which is much harder to transport a living parrot that's going to squawk and make a lot of noise and that you need to keep alive with air and food than it is to transport like a elephant tusk, for example. So you see really sad things where people are trying to transport these in like ridiculous situations. I mean, tubing, toilet paper tubes, hair curlers, thermoses. Those are pictures of living birds stuffed in water bottles to try to transport them from country to country. Because you need to keep them alive, but you need to keep them, quiet. So they're often like drugged, given very little food. It's very sad. Okay, so what are some solutions then? You need a multi-level approach. There are many different people we talked about that come from these source countries, transit countries, destination countries. So you need to look at it at the level of the poacher, of who's buying it at the government level. It's also really important to increase the risk and the penalty of wildlife trafficking. Like we talked about, you rarely are going to prison. If you're caught, you're given some sort of fine. So we need to improve and strengthen our wildlife crime laws and improve our enforcement of wildlife crime. Really importantly, we need to start reducing demand. So we need to educate the people who are buying elephant ivory, for example, on the cruelty, on the environmental impacts, and how it is illegal, the purchasing the elephant ivory, for example. And it's very specific to each region. I mean, just to give an example of this, that's a picture of Yao Ming, the basketball player with an elephant, a baby elephant. And he was super instrumental in reducing demand of ivory in China and in conservation in China in general. So Yao Ming is really like a conservationist. He's appeared in ads in China and public service announcements and calling to an end for illegal wildlife trade, really trying to reach out to the average consumer, the person who would be buying this, and really begging them, telling them about the environmental impacts and how he's not purchasing any things like this and they should not purchase them either. This Yao Ming particularly was instrumental in China's landmark ivory ban in 2017, which really has played a big role in bringing back the elephants. So using these, spokespeople that may have a big microphone in individual countries are really important. You can also destroy the stockpiles. So like I said, with what happened very publicly, and the images were shared everywhere in Kenya, where they took all of this ivory and they burned it to try to prove that the ivory really has no value to them. This is really controversial because less supply could equal more demand. So you're burning all this ivory, there's less ivory to sell, so each individual ivory tusk is going to be more valuable. Also, when you have these stockpiles of ivory, they can be inspected by CITES officials, but when you burn them, obviously you can't verify the amount that was burned in most cases. And a lot of these, more corrupt governments, what's to say they're going to tell CITES officials, we burn 200 tons of ivory when really they just burn 100 tons and then they have 100 tons that can be sold illegally. So this is a real controversial solution. These are just a couple clips to show that a lot of this criminal, the criminal aspect of wildlife crime goes very high into a lot of these governments. So ex-customs officials, customs officer, park guards, people that are supposed to be protecting these animals, they're often some of these middlemen in these illegal trades. So it's difficult to stop the trade when you have people in high levels of authority that are involved in the trade. So we really need to have community-based conservation. We need to understand that a lot of the people that are involved in poaching and trafficking, we need to support them. We need to have other means of economic support for them. We need to prove to them that they can be financial benefits for tourism, hunting that's more sustainable, and the non-financial benefits, the cultural significance, the community empowerment of these animals. We need to, even though it's hard, we need to understand where some of these poachers are coming from. So this was an interview with a couple of poachers. Why did you decide to become a poacher? I lost my parents when I was young, so I had to take care of myself. I became a poacher because I needed to survive, and poaching is a job that pays very well. I tried to get other jobs, but the salary was nothing compared to what I could make to poaching. So we need to find new economic incentives for people who are doing the poaching. So it's more beneficial for them financially to protect the animals than it is to kill and sell the animals.
One solution you may have heard about in the news, specifically for rhinos, would be one particular creative solution would be maybe we poison the rhino horn. And we would do that to try to prevent demand for rhino horn. The idea was you would drill a hole in the rhino. It doesn't hurt. It's like, you know, cutting off your hair. It doesn't hurt or harm the rhino at all. And you would infuse it with something that would make people sick if they consumed the rhino, and it gave it a bright color. So it would inform poachers that you don't want to kill this rhino because the horn is going to make people sick, make them nausea or vomiting or convulsions. So what are the problems with this idea? It seems like a good idea at the onset, but like everything in environmental science, you know, nothing's clear and dry. So there's moral issues. You're poisoning strangers in another country. You know, is that something that is that ethically correct? They found a lot of times that the poachers didn't really care it was poison. They could sell them anyways. The dye soon fades, and they were still able to sell the horn, so they were still killing the rhinos. You can't necessarily do this for every individual rhino. It would probably be more specific from region to region, and so the poaching is just going to shift to areas that hadn't poisoned the horns, and you need to re-poison the horns every 4 years, which is expensive and time-consuming. It relies on publicity in the countries that are buying these rhino horns. The buyers need to know the horns are poisoned to avoid buying them, so that takes a lot of publicity and marketing and advertisements. A lot of times, you know, there's not money to do this. And they found that there was actually, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger mentality, where some people were actually searching out these rhino horns. If they consumed them and they got sick, they felt like maybe they were more immune to it the next time, and then they weren't concerned about purchasing the rhino horns next time. Also, there's no impact on the horns displayed whole. So people were killing the rhinos and selling them, and instead of consuming the rhino horns as medicine, they were just, you know, putting them in their house as kind of like a status symbol. You're not going to get sick from a horn displayed like that, so people were still killing the rhinoceroses. So no solution is straightforward. This is a very complex issue, and it involves many different people, many different stakeholders. And so hopefully we're seeing improvements in some of these animal populations, but it's a very slow, very, very slow process. That's the last slide. This was a quick lecture. This is my quickest lecture. Are there any questions about wildlife crime? Do I need to go back to any PowerPoints? I don't have any chapter notes for this one, but I will post this lecture online. We're good. There's just a couple of you out there still listening, 26 of you. So if there are no questions. All right, I'm going to stop the recording, but I'll still have my audio on. So if you guys have any questions about